This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought, and to debate. Brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. If you like us, please join our community of supporters by giving to our Patreon campaign. You'll find it on our homepage. I'm your co-hostess, Dahlia Shenlin.
And I'm your co-host, Gilad Harpen. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is Gregory Wallance. He's a New York-based attorney, a human rights activist, and a writer whose most recent book has just been published by Potomac Books, which is an imprint of the Nebraska University Press. It's called The Woman Who Fought an Empire, Sarah Aaronsohn and Her Nili Spy Ring. And it tells the story of an Israeli icon, a young Jewish woman who during the First World War operated, together with a few neighbors and family members, a pro-British spy ring under the nose of the Ottoman authorities in Palestine. Her tumultuous life, tragic death, and considerable contribution to the Allied war effort are revisited in this book. Gregory Wallance, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Well, thank you, and I'm delighted to be on your show.
So are we. Okay, so let's start by asking the obvious question. How does a young Jewess from Zichron Yaakov become a British spy?
She became a spy because of two great shocks she experienced after the war started. The first was that she witnessed firsthand the atrocities of the Armenian genocide and became convinced that the same fate awaited the Yishuv, the Jews of Palestine. The second was a young man who she held dear. His name was Avshalom Feinberg, had started a spy ring to aid the British. It was his concept. And then he was killed trying to reach British lines. She was devastated by his death. And in her grief, she resolved to take on the role he had, to lead the spy ring, and mostly male spy ring, and redeem his sacrifice.
It was quite an exploit back then. I mean, we have to talk about the political context of the time. The Jewish community in Palestine was tiny, not very powerful, actually quite the contrary. The Ottoman authorities were overtly hostile to them. A British victory in the First World War wasn't a sure thing yet. Tell us about how the considerations, the pros and cons that led her to take such a courageous stance.
Well, one thing to appreciate is that Sarah, her fellow spies, this young man Avshalom who was killed in the desert, were practically the only Jews in Palestine who believed that Jews would benefit from a British victory. David Ben-Gurion actually tried to raise an army to fight on the Ottoman side. And they were incredibly audacious because at that point, Britain had actually suffered a series of defeats. There was no guarantee they were going to win. They were committing treason against their country. They were subjects of the Ottoman Empire, and none of them had any espionage experience. So for them to take this on, one has to stand back and say, wow, what were these people thinking? And actually what they proved to be quite visionary because they did aid the British Empire, the Great Britain, in winning the war against the Ottoman Empire. That led to the Balfour Declaration, the stepping stone to a Jewish state. And I happen to think that any country that has in its past, if you will, heroines and heroes like these young people has something to be really proud of.
I am curious, though, why you refer to them several times, just the way you did now, as having betrayed their country. To what extent do you think they saw themselves as citizens of the Ottoman Empire and with any form of loyalty, or did they just see themselves as subjects of a colonial regime of a different sort, wishing to break free?
Before the war, I think Jews on the whole had lived relatively comfortably and managed to establish a foothold in the Ottoman Empire. I would say they were tolerated by the Ottomans, and there was some harassment, but it was the war that changed everything. But for them, for these young Jews, it was a major step to break with the Ottoman Empire after the war. It wasn't so much that they regarded themselves as loyal in any way to the Ottoman Empire, but I think it was still a break to, in effect, commit treason, to risk their lives, to throw their lot in with the British.
How significant was their contribution to the British war effort? It is well established that it wasn't just intentions that counted there. They actually made a contribution. Can you tell us about that?
They made a number of contributions, but the one that I think stands out is that after Sarah took over the Nili Spy Ring, she had an agent at a key railway station, and he reported to her that there were advanced airplanes being shipped to the front in the Sinai Desert where the fighting was going on. And these advanced airplanes were the subject of reports by Sarah that ended up at British headquarters in London. And they realized, based on the description of these airplanes, that the British were in danger of losing air superiority to the Ottomans. And new airplanes, advanced English airplanes, were rushed to the front in the Sinai Desert just in time for the Third Battle of Gaza in late October, early November 1917. Why was there a third battle? Because the British had lost the first two battles. And I'm not certain that their offensive in the Sinai Desert, which ultimately carried them to Jerusalem, would have taken place or could have continued if they had lost the Third Battle of Gaza. But it was those advanced airplanes, the result of Sarah's intelligence, that gave them a significant edge in that battle, which they ultimately won. They broke through the Turkish front that stretched from Gaza to Beersheba. They started moving up the roads to Jerusalem, and by early December, Jerusalem had fallen to the British, and General Allenby enters. But by that time, tragically, Sarah was dead, and she never knew what her intelligence had resulted in.
Let's go back a little bit to this moment when they decide to establish the spy ring. I mean, I think it's a fascinating question of really different political analyses at the time. They came to the conclusion that they had to help the British fight the war. Ben-Gurion was on the other side. What gives a band of late teens, early 20s, chutzpahdik people the right to decide we're right about our political gambit, that if the British win, it's going to be better for us? I mean, what were the considerations that led them to that? And I'm curious, of course, to hear more about how she was influenced by her experiences of watching the Armenian genocide, but on the political level.
Well, a number of Jews in Palestine said exactly that. What gives them the right to, in effect, risk our lives in this pursuit of a British victory? Because the perception of, I think, certainly the Jewish establishment, the leaders of the settlements, was that, hey, if the British win, fine, then maybe Jews' lives will be better. But if the Ottoman Empire wins, better not to have given them any reason to settle scores. And they were petrified that Nili, the spying by Sarah, was going to get them killed. In fact, the leaders of Zikron, Yaakov, where she had grown up and where she did some of her espionage, summoned her to a meeting and said, "You are a daughter of this village. You are risking our lives and our property. We demand that you stop your treif, your unclean," which is a huge insult, "your treif activities," and she adamantly refused. But it was a lonely project running the spy ring in Palestine.
I wonder why in your book and in other things that have been written about her, she stands out as the protagonist, because, as you said, Avshalom Feinberg was the mastermind of the spy ring, and if it had not been for his untimely death, he might have led it throughout the war. Her brother, Aaronsohn, was also a well-known agronomer and scientist, even before and during that time. What was it about Sarah herself that all eyes are set on her?
First and foremost, I think it was the circumstances of her death, where she was arrested by the Turks in her hometown in Zikron. She was tortured for 4 days. She not only held out, but she taunted them. "You think because I am a woman, I will be weak." And she wasn't weak. In fact, she so impressed a Turkish officer who was on the scene during her torture that he commented, "She is worth 100 men." But by the end of the 4th day, she thought she could hold out no longer. And she happened to be given the opportunity to go to her home, which is currently part of the Beit Aaronsohn Nili Museum, and change her blood-stained clothes for fresh ones because she was being taken to Constantinople, where she probably would have been hung, and managed to retrieve a gun that she had hidden there, went into the bathroom and shot herself. Even then, she lived another 4 days in agony. And so I think it was this heroic, sacrificial death. And she was trying to protect her own spies because she was afraid if she broke, she would reveal their names and their whereabouts, the ones who hadn't been caught so far. That has caused some people to consider her to be the Jewish Joan of Arc. So that's what stands out. But what I'm more focused on in some ways, it's a gripping, dramatic story, is how this young woman became a leader of men in a society where, put it this way, the Jewish Zionist spirit was bold, but it was not so bold as to recognize the equality of men and women. And most women were expected to stay home, tend the house, raise the children, and Sarah just didn't want any of that. She was just totally lost on her. I wouldn't call her a feminist. She just didn't care about it, and she did it her own way. And that, I think, is not just her death, but the way she lived. That is one of the reasons I wanted to write this book and bring that out.
Well, since you wrote the book in order to focus on her, let me ask about the guys. Because you do paint an interesting picture of both her brother Aaron and Avshalom, and you do spend quite a bit of time developing their characters, and as well as some of the other men. And I would say the thing that they seem to have in common in your portrayal of both of Aaron, her brother, Avshalom, and also Yosef Leshensky is that they seem to share these kind of daring, dashing, arrogant qualities. Am I wrong to see that in your conjuring up of who they were? And how would you know those personality qualities in your historical research?
You're not wrong in that characterization. These were among the most flamboyant, courageous, creative, intelligent, and impetuous, brash men you would ever want to meet. And that's one of the things that is such a contrast with Sarah, because she was level-headed. She didn't get easily upset. She wasn't impetuous. She was cool and calculating. She was better at espionage than any of them. I drew the characterizations from documents, original documents. I was so fortunate. I came to Israel 2 years ago to do research, and I went to the Beit Aaronsohn Nili Museum and discovered, with the assistance of the archivists there, the staff, who were just terrific, that there was an abundance of letters that Sarah had written that hadn't appeared, at least in any English language works on Nili or any of these people. And letters from Avshalom have been published in Israel. He's regarded as Israel's first Sabra and so on. And Aaron kept a diary. But I was really able, using Sarah's letter, to put together this contrasting picture of these flamboyant, headstrong men and this cool, level-headed, sober young women.
You know, Dalia and I, before this, while we were preparing for this interview, we were talking about the perception of Sarah in our respective native countries. Me growing up in Israel, Sarah Aaronsohn was this huge, towering figure. I mean, I think it also has to do with the fact that we all had to learn about her in school, and all thanks to that very good children's book, Sarah Giborat Nili, Sarah, the heroine of Nili, that we all had to read, and I remember vividly to this day. And Dalia told me that in her Jewish youth movement and other...
And in general, Sarah was practically not present.
Yeah.
In the United States.
Yeah,
in the United States. How do you account for that? And do you see the book as an attempt to bridge the gap?
Exactly what I had in mind in writing the book. I wanted to make Sarah, because her story is so incredible and an inspiration, I wanted to make Sarah accessible in the United States to Americans. And I hope I've started down that road and that I'll get there.
Why do you think it didn't happen until now?
First, I think American Jews don't have the same relationship to the history of Israel, particularly the pre-state history. There's much more identification with Israel after independence in 1948, the wars it's had to fight, the struggle it's engaged in even to today, than there is the pre-state history. And indeed, World War I as a whole in the United States is forgotten. In Britain, in France, the suffering, the slaughter, they still remember it like it was just a few decades ago. But in the United States, it's forgotten, even in the centennial year of America's entry into the war, which was this year. It just, or I should say last year, it just didn't resonate.
I was wondering, are you trying to make her accessible, or is there a way in which your book is sort of glamorizing her and mythologizing her and making people kind of want to be inspired by her the way you are? Is there anything critical in this book about her, or what she represented or what she did?
I think if there's anything that might be perceived as critical, it's her tough-mindedness. There was a moment in those awful days when she was being tortured, where the Turks arrested her father, who had nothing to do with the Nili Spy Ring, and tortured him severely. And she told him, "Do not break. Remember the Maccabees, Father." In other words, she could have stopped his torture if she had simply told the Turks what they wanted to hear. That's why they were torturing him, because they thought that would cause her to break. He kind of replied to her, "Don't tell me who the Maccabees are. You don't have to tell me." But that's
meaning what? I've been through enough of this.
Yes,
I don't need you to.
I know Jewish history. I
know.
know what's required of Jews in these circumstances, and he didn't break. But I wondered sometimes about this young woman who is now so committed that she's allowing her father to be tortured. And yet I came away feeling that with Sarah and these other young people, that somehow what you were seeing was, call it not the founders of Israel, but the founding spirit of Israel, in the sense that they were brave, they were creative and visionary, and they were also tough, because that's what was needed, I think, to create this country and to keep it alive, if you will.
I want to go back to what Dalia said earlier about the Armenian genocide and the way to which it affected her and basically prompted her to take action. Do you see the fact that Israel, to this day, the fact that Israel doesn't recognize the Armenian genocide as such is in a way a betrayal of Sarah Aaronsohn's heritage? Because in a way it was the Armenian genocide and the horror that was associated with it that, as you say, started this chain reaction that led to the British occupation of Palestine and then to the creation of the State of Israel.
Honestly, I don't see it as a betrayal of Sarah's heritage as much as I see it disrespect of Israel's own heritage, if you will, which is the Holocaust. I understand that there are, call it geopolitical considerations, and I can't defend my own country because my own country hasn't recognized the Armenian genocide. Even President Obama refused to call it what it was for fear of losing, key air bases in Turkey and so on. But there's no excuse for not calling the Armenian genocide what it was, and the Jews, of all people, should be the first to say a genocide that fits the description of a genocide. We know better than anyone else what a genocide is. It isn't so much that you're condemning Turkey today. You're simply saying, be honest about your past. If these crimes are recognized openly and discussed, then they're less likely to occur again. I'm
not sure if we know to say that in the course of human history, if we know about crimes and discuss them, that we're less likely to repeat them, because we've seen other forms of genocide in the late 19th and late 20th century, unfortunately. I mean, that's true when you think of Rwanda. Yeah.
But it's still, you're better off having open discussions, acknowledging your past. We have a past that is not entirely something to be proud of, and we're better off acknowledging. There's a new museum that opened in Mobile, Alabama, devoted to the lynching of African Americans. And I haven't been there, but I've seen the photos. I found it absolutely staggering emotionally. And I said, God bless them. That's exactly what is needed. And I think the more people come to terms with their past, I think there'll be more of a constituency when things go off the tracks to try to stop it.
But that's leading us in quite a different direction from your book, because you're talking about, as an American, you want to recognize where America has been guilty of crimes in the past, and that advocating for other countries to recognize Turkey's genocide of the Armenians. So on the other hand, though, your book celebrates a certain form of defiance and heroism about the Israeli past. I mean, maybe your next book is going to be about Israel acknowledging aspects of its past that it doesn't like or should acknowledge were wrong.
I really haven't decided on what my next book is going to be. Yeah, I mean, look, there's a debate going on in this country, and I pick it up a lot in the U.S. in various ways, over the displacement of Palestinians during and after the Independence War. And I can only say that that should be dealt with honestly and openly. If that happened, or it happened in a greater degree that has been previously acknowledged, I think that should be discussed and debated. And ultimately, I think the country will be better off if that is brought out in the open.
But I do think that raises a complex question about the characters in your book, because they are displaying, okay, let's get away from the judgmental term like arrogance. They're displaying a certain independent-mindedness when it comes to taking extremely consequential political decisions about what to do. And it seems to me like your book celebrates their bravery, their courage, their critical thinking. But would you advocate a lesson like that for, young school children growing up? Be a rebel, betray your country if you need to. I mean, how do we take a lesson like that and say, and what do we do with it? Because we can't use it all the time or we'd be in chaos, right?
Well, I'm not certain that they're universal lessons, and every situation is different. Remember the time. The Ottoman Empire, 6 centuries old, is on the verge of collapse. And if I could use a basketball metaphor,
do you have
in
to?
effect,
I'm just kidding. Just kidding.
In effect,
wait. We do have a book here about women heroines. I mean, how do we know this would be the appropriate metaphor? She might want a metaphor about something. Okay, I'm just kidding.
Women basketball is very popular in the U.S. It was, in effect, jump ball. Every minority in the Ottoman Empire wanted independence. The Arabs were, the Arab revolt was taking place sort of, in a way, I think of it as a somewhat parallel dynamic to what was going on in Palestine, and also what Zionists around the world were doing. And so I think in those circumstances, yes, the lesson is act. Be brave, be bold. Because otherwise, look, Sarah had this vision. I don't know what would have happened if Great Britain had been defeated. Would the Ottomans have then slaughtered the Jews en masse? It's sort of speculative. But in the long run, from the point of view of Jews, this necessity to be bold proved to be absolutely right in view of what happened in World War II. I think the dynamic that was taking place was that these establishment Jewish leaders were saying, look, we have survived for millennia. We have kept our traditions intact by, in times like this, keeping our heads down and riding out the storm. And that didn't work in World War II. In fact, the consequences of not recognizing and acting early were just enormous. And that, I think, is where, there's always a choice to be made. You'll never know how things turn out. They couldn't know how things would turn out. But I think Sarah's boldness in the face of what she perceived to be an existential threat to the Jewish people has proven since then to be, in general, the right course of action for Jews. I mean, isn't that what this country represents? Is boldness in the face of an or arising from what was a near existential threat to the Jewish people?
I mean, it's just so interesting that to question whether she would have seen the threat in universal terms, the way you're putting it, like if there's an existential threat, we must identify it and fight it, or if she would have said the Ottoman Empire did this horrible stuff to the Armenians, which she witnessed. But I wonder if she would ever have anticipated that kind of existential threat and barbarism would have come from the heart of Europe, barely a few decades later after her death.
I don't think she could have. Most people didn't. Most people didn't anticipate it in 1938 or 1939.
Or in 1945 until they saw the actual documentation.
Exactly. I think it was a visceral thing with her. I mean, this ordeal of this, she was traveling home from Constantinople where she was living. Her train trip took her across the Anatolian plateau. She witnessed the families staggering in the dust, being herded by the Ottoman soldiers, the dogs feeding on the decomposing bodies. She saw a train at one station run over dozens of Armenians who were sort of scattered around the tracks because they were terribly ill with dysentery. And the engineer on the train jumps out and says, "See how I have slaughtered these Armenian swine?" She faints. And when she comes to, Ottoman officials nearby berate her for her lack of patriotism. If you go through something like that, and this was day after day after day, that has a visceral impact. You feel it, you see it, and her sense of the vulnerability of A, the brutality of the Ottomans, and B, the vulnerability of the small minority. The Armenians numbered 2 million. And if the Ottomans could do it that easily, to the Armenians, then what would they do to the Jews, the helpless 85,000 or so Jews who were in Palestine at the outbreak of the war?
The book is meticulously researched. I mean, you worked on it for years, consulted many archives. Are you regretting now having become a lawyer, not a historian?
Well, no, I'm not. I really had a very satisfying and rewarding legal career. I've always been fascinated by history. My last book was about it was called America's Soul in the Balance, and it was about the U.S. State Department's response to the Holocaust. And that drew me into, obviously, the Holocaust, but also World War II. And so I'm fascinated by World War II. My father was a soldier in World War II. But World War I is very appealing, I think, to almost any historian because it was so seminal. And so much of our times today, we look around, you can see the effects of World War I. So I've always been interested in those big events. And then the issue of moral choices that individuals in the context of those events make have always fascinated me. In the America's Soul in the Balance book, it was about some young lawyers in the Treasury Department who learned that the State Department was not only covering up reports of the Holocaust, but actually blocking rescue attempts in Europe where rescue was possible. They were so outraged, they launched a campaign to stop it and ultimately succeeded that led to a change in American policy, and that led in turn to the rescue of 200,000 Jews before the end of the war. But these moral choices are fascinating to me. And Sarah, we were just talking about it, made a moral choice. They're not always black and white. You don't know how it's all going to turn out. And it's those circumstances that I'm always fascinated by. That's what drew me into this.
How did you discover her story? I mean, as we said, it's not very well known in America. How did you come about it?
It was first the interest in writing a book about World War I. Second, I wanted to write about espionage. And as a former federal prosecutor, I work with the same techniques: recruiting informants, running undercover operations, wiretapping.
You are the movies.
And then I wanted to write about a woman spy.
Why?
Because the Hollywood depiction of women spies is so stereotyped as to be abhorrent. They fall into two categories if you follow Hollywood. One is the femme fatale, the woman who, using her seductive powers,
Mata Hari
the Mata Hari, who came out of World War I, by the way, seduces a man into revealing important secrets and then betrays him to his death. And you can find episodes in Homeland with Carrie Mathison where she did exactly that. The second stereotype is women don't want to spy. They're forced into it. Think Femme Nikita, where the woman is faced with 100 years in prison. Or, the most recent Red Swallow with Jennifer Lawrence, where she suffers this career-ending ballet injury, and the only career option she has left, it seems, and the only way to support her mother is to enroll herself in spy assassin school where her sexual powers are weaponized. And it's absurd. And that's the great thing about Sarah, is it was none of that. She had the motives I described, and she wasn't using alleged sexual powers. She was using skill and daring and intelligence to spy.
Well, it seems like you might enjoy, if you ever want to read fiction, because, you're a serious person, you're a federal prosecutor and a historian, but if you ever want to read fiction, it sounds like you're a classic audience for another great TLV1 Tel Aviv Review guest, Adam Labor, who's written the trio of books about the Yael Azulai Israeli spy series, thriller. She's the main character, and she's a Mossad spy, and, great books.
Yeah.
All of our readers should read them. I mean, all of our listeners.
Listeners, absolutely, yeah.
From history to fiction and back again, and in this case, history is stranger than fiction.
Often it is.
Gregory Wallance, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you both.
And thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Julia Brahms and Itai Shelem, our producers. And a big thank you to the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute for their generous support. Now, a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review. Then write one. Check out our archives. We have over 450 interviews. If you like us, you can like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel, and follow both Gilad and me on Twitter. Join us next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.